maybe I'm just gonna.
I'll follow your
Okay,
lead.
we are, I think, live. Hello and welcome. I'm in my slightly unusual format again today. I've got a special guest with me, the wonderful Hilary Smart, who is a former financial modeling world champion and a member of the question design team of that competition for many years, as well as just being, a long time operas person. So she's a very serious professional modeler and just an interesting and thoughtful person. So Hilary, welcome. Thank you for joining me.
Thank you. It's always nice to talk to you.
Likewise. This is a little bit different from usual, but we'll just pretend that nobody's here.
Well, probably nobody is, so that's fine.
It always starts quiet. So let me just jump in. Actually, I'm going to start with the first question that came in advance in the live chat, which is back in the day when you won ModelOff and when I won ModelOff, there was a very hefty prize fund for it. Did you do anything wild or indulgent with the money you won?
Well, I was kind of I just got married. We hadn't bought a house yet, so most of it went into a savings account. But
Very responsible.
I was very responsible. I do have three younger sisters who all at that point had partners, and I was the oldest one. So I did do like a cottage for a week in the Isle of Wight, and we all went on a holiday together.
Oh, that's very cool.
Yeah, because they were quite a bit younger than me, so like financially at that point there was quite a disparity. So that was fun.
That conjures a very sort of Jane Austen vibe.
Except none of the boys were dicks, so it was fine.
Oh, that's not very Jane Austen at all, then, is it?
They've all chosen lovely boys.
Good. Aside from frivolous spending money, I'm curious, did you find that winning ModelOff had a big effect on your career, either kind of immediately or long term?
I think probably a little bit. And it's difficult to be entirely sure because obviously I was gaining experience anyway and getting more experience anyway. But I did feel that there was a slight shift from because as a model auditor, you often deal with people that you don't know because you're dealing with lots of different transactions, lots of different teams. And I did slightly feel that I went from a situation where if I went into interaction with someone who hadn't met me before, the default assumption before was that I was kind of young, possibly female, didn't necessarily know what I was doing. And until I said something intelligent, the assumption was that I wasn't very clever. Well, not that I wasn't very clever, but that I was, junior and didn't necessarily know that much. Whereas after I won ModelOff, I never in an interaction really felt like I had to prove myself before people started taking me seriously. So that was nice. And then down the line, kind of, so I was at Operis then, I'm at Operis now. I've got two small children, and after my first child was born, at that point, kind of hybrid working wasn't really a thing, and part-time working wasn't as much of an option as it is now. And I kind of had to choose between doing what I thought was best for my family and staying at Operis, and doing what was best for my family one. And that meant I was then looking for another job, and I found one that was close to home and would allow me to work mornings, and the work was still interesting and I liked the team. And the interview process for that was relatively easy. And I think that kind of having ModelOff on my CV for that, I think probably helped, because everybody just accepted that I knew what I was doing and that there was no need to kind of,
Yeah, I mean, it makes sense, right? Like you think about how many people have proficient at Excel on their CV, their resume. I always forget which word I'm supposed to use according to the side of pond I'm on. But anyway, just having some kind of proof goes a long way toward not having to. All right, but do you know how a VLOOKUP works? Can you do pivot tables?
No, I can't actually.
Well, I can't really either.
I've never had to, so it's fine. And I do think there is a place for things like that, because obviously in the world I'm in at the moment now, I work in a company where everybody can model. So if you talk to someone and they say, "Oh, I can model," like we can kind of figure out whether you're telling the truth or not. But a lot of companies, if they're hiring a modeler, they don't necessarily have anybody internally that can verify whether or not that person is good at the kind of modeling that they need. So I think in that way, stuff like ModelOff, the FNWC, the sort of qualifications that have popped up that kind of weren't around back in the day.
Yeah.
I think they do have a place for that kind of stuff as well.
Yeah, I agree. I mean, not to, be overly self-indulgent, but there's also something to be said for the value of, getting a good external perspective, because if you don't know how to ask a question to figure out if the person you're interviewing can model, you probably also don't actually know what it is that you need. And then you might have bigger problems. So I was kind of imagining this coming up later, but since you hit on it, I do want to ask you a little bit more about the world of part-time work, because, well, I've always told you I think you make good life decisions, and it sounds like that was one. But B, I think, for you in modeling land, for me in banking land, like we've both kind of come through, let's say, industries where part-time work is not particularly normal, but sort of both made the switch anyway. I'd be interested to hear a little bit more about, like, I mean, just first of all, how did you find it? Like, how did you come across a part-time opportunity, or did you sort of create a part-time opportunity?
So in terms of the position I took just after my eldest was born, I got approached by an ex-colleague who said, I've got this position that's kind of in your area, maybe looking for somebody part-time. Would you like to talk to them? And I was like, yes, I would. And yeah, I think, and then they basically just asked me what I wanted to do. And I said, well, I've got a baby that doesn't sleep except on top of me. So I want to work 4 hours a day in the morning so that he can have his afternoon nap. And they said, all right. Which I think probably the background that I had, so basically they let me set my own terms, and what I was willing to do. And I think the background that I had probably helped me in that position.
Yeah. I mean, I think it's super interesting. I've never been like a banker, but I've worked in banking for many, many years. And there's such a presumption there that any leverage you have has to be, parlayed into more money. And I think it's like my number one insight from having shifted to part-time is like, maybe there are other things you can do with your leverage that will make you happier. And it's like you saying, you've got to set your own terms because you're very good at what you do, and that's what you wanted.
Yes. The decisions that we've made for our family are not, I mean, obviously, if we won the lottery, we would do things differently, but the decisions we make for our family are more limited by the time and the effort that we have available than they are by the money that we have available. So although, like, and I got approached by a recruiter on LinkedIn recently, and they were not particularly, sometimes they're very polite, sometimes they're a bit pushy. And I almost got to the point of sending them an RC email back of, yeah, you might be about to offer me more money, but it's not a better package because I'm very happy where I am, and it lets me do all these things, and it lets me balance my life, and I love my colleagues, and I love my work, and I enjoy what I'm doing. And ultimately, the way to, like, obviously if somebody offers me more money, I'm not going to say no, because it always gives you more options, but that's not what I need to optimize my life for. So why would I?
Very, very wise and spot on, I think.
Very wise.
So tell me, I mean, I've heard about this before, but tell everyone about, like, I have a sense that when you went back to Operas, there was a bit more of a, not kind of finding, but more creating an opportunity to suit. Just tell me a bit about how that went.
So they had kind of made it clear to me that the door was open, which was lovely. And then I got to the point where I was like, well, when I joined the company I was at, then the models were a mess and everything needed rebuilding, and it was really interesting. And I rebuilt them now, and they're not a mess anymore. And it's slightly less interesting. And also the children are a little bit bigger, so that kind of 4 hours a day thing wasn't such a big problem. So I called up one of my friends and I said, you said the door was open. Is it really open? And they were like, yeah, come and talk to us. And we had a conversation and I said, well, these are the hours I want to do. And they said, okay, so then these are the things that might be interesting for you to do. And I said, yeah, that sounds interesting. So I don't manage live projects. I do QA, I do sort of do peer reviews of stuff and kind of that sort of thing, but I don't manage live projects because of the part-time nature of what I'm working on. But I have quite a lot. I'm very grateful for the freedom I have to kind of do the things that I think are interesting and need doing. So some of that's reviewing work, and I've been able to get involved in quite a bit of training of the new joiners, which I find very rewarding and have really loved doing. So that's been great as well. But yeah, generally, if I've any, and I also have taken back, because it used to be mine, responsibility for like the audit process and changes to that process. So that's been really nice, and kind of, yeah, just having the freedom to go, I don't think there's anything where I've gone, that looks really interesting and I'd like to do that. Can I do that? And had somebody say no. So that's been nice.
That's great. I mean, it's interesting that you're managing to kind of strike the balance of sort of being around client work without being exposed to the vicissitudes, shall we say, of client demands. That's good. Nice. You managed to find the balance. So since you mentioned training the new people, one of the things I was going to ask you about is, any advice you would have for sort of early career financial modeler or someone who wants to become a financial modeler?
Well, I suppose the one thing everybody can do is, I've got this friend named Dim Early. He's made all the old ModelOff questions available. And I do think, and I know we're going to maybe talk about question writing later, we approached question writing a bit differently back then, because we had the 2 online rounds and then the finals, and the finals was kind of what decided the final winner. I think the 2 online rounds tended to be a bit more accessible. So we tended to try and make sure that like there was almost no pre-required knowledge for it. Everything should be written on the case, like somebody who with a mathematical bent and not very much finance background should be able to mathematical bent, some knowledge of Excel and not much finance background, should be able to read the case studies and should be able to work through, which I don't think is as true of the way that the FMWC cases are designed now.
Yeah, I think that's right. I think there's a bit more kind of technical prerequisite there.
Yeah, and that it kind of makes sense because almost every round is the finals because everything counts, whereas we had these kind of pre-qualifying rounds and those were explicitly meant to be more accessible. So I think in terms of for someone starting out, having a go at those cases, there's actually quite a wide range of them covering quite a wide range of topics. They're kind of quite accessible. So yeah, having a go at those and working through them in your own time probably will take longer than we would have allowed for them back in the day, but then the time constraint was part of how you select the finalists. But yeah, that's a good one, I think. Yeah, I think that's probably mostly what I can offer.
Yeah, I mean, I've always been a big fan of those questions as a good way for people to learn, because it's the sort of, bite-sized task and immediate feedback, and like immediate precise feedback, not just like you structured this kind of right, but is this exactly the right answer given those assumptions that you just don't normally get on the job because somebody doesn't build the same model they assign you to build to make sure you got every answer right. So yeah, I'm a big fan of that. So sticking with ModelOff for a minute, I got a Lawrence Lau has put a question in the chat. You can see his analytical bent coming out here. She said, you know that the ModelOff prize pool changed a lot over time. Top 3 prizes were $40,000 in 2012, $10,000 in 2019. Assuming participant fees / sponsors drive the prize pool, I'd conclude that ModelOff failed to maintain interest from external stakeholders, i.e. global training camps and private leagues are nice but didn't work. Question, what happened particularly after 2014 and onward? If you don't know, what's your best opinion and what would you have done differently if you ran ModelOff?
Well, Firstly, I'm not sure that's right, because I think there was sponsorship for, I don't, so in terms of the participant fees, I'm not sure the participant fees were ever necessarily that relevant in terms of the prize money. I don't actually know, because I wasn't quite privy to the
yeah, that sounds kind of right to me as well. Like I think they were, I think they usually took a view of like more important to have more people competing. Like I think there were lots of, you know, free tickets for college students or free tickets for, you know, new entrants, or there was always more of a focus on get people in than kind of make money from entry fees. So I think that part's right.
And I, in terms of how it went wrong, if it went wrong, because I think it was, it kind of collapsed. So I think that probably the decrease in, firstly, sorry, let me collate my thoughts. I think the organisers thought it was very important to have a big prize money pot available early on, because they thought that's what would make people take the competition seriously. So I think those early prize pots were larger for those reasons, which you and I benefited from.
Yes.
We're lucky.
And then pulled up that ladder.
So I'm not sure that you can necessarily read as much in terms of the decrease in the prize money as is stated in the question.
Yeah, that's my sense. I mean, similarly, not having ever been privy to the actual financial workings of the competition, but yeah, I took it as a signal of the strength of their marketing position in a sort of inverse way. Exactly like you said, that they needed a big prize fund to attract people early on. They didn't need as big a prize fund to get people to come back. And again, loose sense, but my sense is that actually the financial position of the competition was probably better over time as the prize money was going down. It's just they didn't feel like they needed it. But I think ModelOff shrinking and then eventually going away, again, my sense is more a function of the guys who ran, like the first few years, it was their number one thing, and for a while it was their biggest thing, and then they got a lot more success with the whole sports analytics world, and they couldn't put the time that they had put into it in the earlier years, so they sold it. And then I'm not 100% sure why the full stack modeler people bought it and then ran it so briefly. But I mean, it may just be that they realized it was a lot of work in doing these things, and it was more than they anticipated, or maybe it was something else that they were looking for. I don't know.
Yeah, I think because there've been a few of us designing the questions, and then I think when Full Stack Modeler bought it, I think that was kind of a natural exit point for many of us. So I think there was quite an experienced question design team with ModelOff. And then I'm not sure that, I can't remember who stayed with it. So I left. I think I just couldn't commit the time to it that I had been committing to it, and so I didn't follow it when it went.
I think you left, and I think Dan left. Maybe I think Dan stayed on one more.
Possibly.
I don't know. I'm mixing myself up.
But yeah, I think probably the two main challenges that we, in terms of participation, which was something that we would have discussed with the QDT, obviously I was not privy to QDT is what we used to call ourselves as the question design team. And I think probably two main challenges, which I think probably are still challenges for FMWC, and I'll be interested to see what they do. I think the Excel battles does address some of this, but do you have the same people going to the finals every year? And that kind of becomes a bit of a self-fulfilling thing, because the more experience you have, like the easier it is, like the more likely you are to do better next year. So if you've got someone like yourself who has been kind of competing for a number of years, you're kind of maybe not quite guaranteed a spot in the final, but you're exceedingly likely to get there. And then kind of what's the draw as a new person to come in? So the kind of that sort of piece around, is it always the same finalists in terms of, does that make the competition attractive to people who haven't participated before? And this, I think, possibly is more of a challenge for FMWC, or maybe not, is it fun to do if you're not going to make the finals? So is there still value in, if you look at it and go, hey, there's no way I'm ever making the finals, is it still fun to do and worthwhile to enter? And I think they probably maybe have done a bit of a better, well, done a better job than ModelOff did in terms of building a bit of a community around it that sort of exchanges information. And obviously the battles, because they're a bit more, I'm going to say random in terms of who wins them. Like you can have a bad day and lose them, and somebody who's new has a chance of winning those in a way that they don't necessarily have as good a chance of coming top over a series of 12 rounds. So yeah.
Yep. No, I think the randomness adds a lot to the excitement of it. I say that having been knocked out in, not made the last 64 or maybe 32. I don't know. I haven't come anywhere close in the knockout format for a couple of years now. Hoping that'll change, but who knows? But I remember people saying to me at the time, because a couple of times, like I did like relatively well across the group, but I was up against someone who just did better. And I remember people saying, well, wouldn't it be better if they just said the top half of people go through rather than head to head? And I remember saying to Andrew at the time, like, don't change it. Like you want the randomness to make it more exciting, less predictable. It's more fun that way. So I mean, it's interesting when you say about what's the draw. If it's the same people over and over again, and I think if anything, that's probably more so now because there's not a final. I think you lose some element of that randomness. Like it's, I think it's not just kind of the same group of people. It's mostly the same group of people in the same order because, there's enough repetitions, there's enough rounds that a lot of the noise kind of cancels out in a way that, in a ModelOff final, there'd be some crazy hard question and, most of the time nobody would get it finished. And there was a lot of kind of randomness. Like, it was very hard, like Joseph was the only person who ever won it twice. That's hard to replicate when it's, all league and no knockout.
Yeah, exactly. And one thing I haven't quite, so obviously with the new format with the time bonuses, there's often quite a wide gap between the person who comes first, second, third, and the rest of the crowd. And I don't quite know why they've made this decision, because when they do the long-term rankings, they normalize it twice, I think. So it's like,
yeah.
And I don't know why they don't do that for the normal scores.
I don't know. I mean, I know that the whole normalization thing is, I don't know. I have pretty mixed feelings about it. I think it's really demoralizing for some people when, you get most of the questions right and then your score gets normalized to like 500 because, Lawrence finished with an hour to spare, which he increasingly does.
So that's one change I would make if I was in charge. I would normalize it twice so that the medium score is 500, which is what they do for the long-term rankings. So they're already calculating those numbers, and your top people would still come top, and your person who won would still win, and probably would still win the overall thing, but just you're not getting a score back of 400.
Yeah. I mean, I suspect I would probably also consider just making there be less of a time bonus. Like, 10 points a minute is, unless you're going very fast, you're getting more points for not doing it than you are for the work you're doing. So that's a challenge. But the other thing I wanted to circle back on is, like, when you said about what's the draw, I think a big part of the thing is, no matter what we try to say, I think people, the big draw for this is I want to win or I want to do well or whatever. When I think, and I'd be interested to hear your kind of view on this, but when I think about the benefit that I got from years of entering ModelOff, I think the benefit that I got from the sort of exposure and profile and winning and whatever was actually quite a bit smaller than the benefit I got of just a lot of kind of focused practice across a wide range of modeling things and just getting better at my job. And I feel like we almost missell it by having so much emphasis on, you could win, there's prize money, whatever. It's like the financial value to you of becoming a better modeler by, practicing 3 rounds from a wide variety of financial modeling topics once every 6 weeks over a year, and then getting to look at a professional model of how it's done, is probably, like, if you're an early career person, at least, the financial value of that is probably a lot more than the financial value of the prize you might get. At least that's my perspective.
Yeah, I think that's probably right. And I think the one thing the competition does is it kind of exposes you to. So I've been competing again a little bit, partly because like my company.
I was going to ask you about that.
And yeah, sometimes it's just not in my area, and I just don't know the tools for that. And if it was something I was interested in doing, I could then after the fact go and look up how to do it, and then I would know next time. And yeah, I think I had a different experience to you because you competed all those years, whereas I competed 2 years and then I was on the question design team. So for me, I think the biggest thing that I got from ModelOff was being part of another community of modelers. So obviously being on the QDT, we had a reasonable amount to do with each other through the year. We were kind of having chats and obviously QAing each other's questions. We back in those days, the finals used to be, and they are again this year, I hear. Finals used to be in person. So you go and I met you, I met Alex, Dan, lots of people who I would now count as friends, who are kind of in that same sort of slightly geek space, which is nice. And I do have a community of that at work, but it's a lovely community. And you'd think that you kind of would think the sort of stereotype of the kind of person that competes in an Excel competition is that you don't necessarily want to spend a lot of time with them. But that wasn't true.
Yeah, it's funny. I did the maths Olympiad when I was in high school, and like you meet some really like weird, socially awkward people. I mean, not all of them by any means. I met lots of nice people there as well, but like some of the kind of really serious ones who've been, taken out of normal school and sort of hothoused for a few years, just like very odd people. And I kind of assumed that was who I was going to meet at the ModelOff. And then so I guess someone mentioned to me later, it's like you think about how you learn good financial modeling skills versus like, good competitive math skills. Like you learn it by succeeding in a professional environment that kind of also filters for ability to interact with clients and other things. So it's, in some sense, it's not that surprising, but it was interesting for me.
I guess I expected people to be not that I expected people to be very socially awkward, but I expected them to be very, very competitive and like not in a fun way. And that wasn't true. Yeah. Yeah,
totally. No, I think it's actually a pretty relaxed, sort of supportive community. So let's talk a little bit more about your QDT question design team experience. Like, what makes a good question? How do you come up with questions?
So I guess when I was on the question design team, we'd sort of sit down and brainstorm areas. I think one weakness that ModelOff had was that because it was basically the same people year on year, I think Alex and Dan and I did it together for a number of years, with occasionally other people stepping in to do the odd question. But we all had we'd all sort of come from project finance kind of background. So there probably was a bias towards that kind of question. So that was probably a weakness. But we did kind of sit down and sort of talk about, these are the different, like, have we done a real estate one? Maybe we should do a real estate one. I would kind of keep an eye on sort of interesting problems that I saw through the year and kind of think, maybe that would make a good ModelOff case. And we sort of tended to break it down a bit. So obviously we had the 2 online rounds. I only ever wrote questions for the rounds. I never wrote questions for the finals. I think probably there were 3 reasons for that. One was that I probably felt more comfortable kind of pitching the difficulty level for the rounds, because for the finals, there was always a bit of like, we really don't want to get 2 people to get 100%. So actually the kind of the difficulty calibration for that really mattered. And I never felt so confident with that. Second was that I think some of the guys sort of, that was the more sexy thing, writing for the finals. And they were a little bit like, they preferred that, whereas I actually enjoyed the challenge of writing something that was accessible. And I was the best at meeting deadlines, and round 1 happens first.
Yeah, I do remember a bit of the behind the scenes fun of the deadlines.
So I think by 2018, which I think was the last year involved, I think round one was entirely mine.
Yes, I remember that. I remember that. I was like, yeah, we've just given up on collaborating with each other. Hillary's just going to do the whole round.
So yeah, there was that. So yeah, it was kind of a case of, and then we would talk a lot about, like, we were kind of about August, we'd have kind of some planning discussions about, right, these are the vague question areas, these are the people that are going to write those questions, and we would normally then cross assign. So like I would QA, say Alex's, and Dan would QA, and Alex would QA with it. Like we would each kind of, like, we'd pair up for QA in terms of a few rounds of making sure we'd knocked out the issues, that we kind of calibrated at the right time. And then the third person who hadn't seen the questions at all would then do a full run at it under exam conditions, as it were, and report back on how that experience was, like whether the wording was, because obviously once you've read it a few times and you've iterated through, you don't necessarily pick up on any issues.
Yes, what somebody might miss.
Yeah,
Yep.
what's unclear in the wording. So yeah, that was one thing I think we did do well with ModelOff, is that I think the questions were quite clearly written, but that was because it was only 3 rounds in a year, and because there was kind of a dedicated team that was QAing it, it kind of, we could do that.
Yeah. I mean, it's interesting that, like, there's some real advantages to having the whole, the whole world contributes. It does mean that the range of questions in FMW.
Yes. Can't hear Dim anymore. This is embarrassing. I don't know if anybody can see me.
Oh, no,
Hello.
never mind. You're moving again. Sorry.
It went very still from my
Oh,
end.
oh dear, you went still on my end as well. But okay, it looks like we're back, I think.
Yeah.
Touch wood. I think you've touched on this a bit already, but a question from the chat is, how much testing did you have to do when designing the questions to make sure the balance was at least close to optimal?
Yeah, so we create each other's questions, and there were a few times where so with ModelOff, each year the champion from the previous year then qualified for the final the next year, so they didn't have to do the rounds. So we occasionally asked the champion from the previous year to have a run at the round in its entirety as well. So that was another thing that we did.
I think that's the only reason that I actually made it to the finals in 2015, because the rounds were happening like right as my first son was being born. So it is more important. You and I have often talked about good life choices. So all right, I'm going to grab one more question out of the chat, and then I want to ask you a separate thing. But so Lawrence asked, if you were appointed the CEO of the FMWC today, what changes would you implement, either to the 3 competitions, the marketing, or anything else?
Okay, I think that's probably assuming I'm more familiar with the inner workings of the FMWC than I am. I think I would implement the change I said about how you score the rounds. I think the fact you're going back in person for the finals is, I got mixed feelings about this, because I've become a bit more militant about minimizing flying. But I think there is value in in-person meetups. There's value in kind of like building that community and building friendships in a way that which you don't, it can't really be done. And you can maintain friendships online, but it's quite difficult to build them in the same way, especially for a community. And I think there is value in that, so I think that's good. But I think the kind of the randomness of the battles is good. I would love to say that I would fix the gender diversity issue, but I mean, obviously I was involved in ModelOff for a number of years and never managed to have the right idea for how to kind of attract more women to the competition. So obviously saying I would fix that is a bit arrogant, given I failed to do so.
Well, okay, so let's grab that third rail really hard right now. So it's an interesting question for me. Like, I think about this a lot because of, the industry I'm in. There's a constant kind of discussion about, a lot of big businesses now, like whatever, big banks, big consulting firms or whatever, have got to, parity or so in their, new intake hiring, and don't look at all like that at their sort of partnership level. The industry as a whole is very, very gender unbalanced. But one of the things that we talk about a lot is, where, like, how much of that can anyone kind of step along the way possibly take responsibility for? And, when you think of it as whatever, a pipeline from, 50-50 boys and girls are born approximately equally all the way through education system, college, early career development, everything else that might lead you to taking part in something like FMWC. Like, I guess part of the question is, how do you think about what is, well, just not their problem because, the industry is unbalanced? How do you think about what could they do differently? What's the right target? Like, I don't think, unless in a kind of much bigger picture, the whole world changes way, I don't think it makes sense to say the right target is for the FMWC to be 50-50 men and women, all the way up and down the competition. But at the same time, where we are today with very, very low gender balance is probably also not the target.
Yeah.
How do you think about that?
Again, I wish I had the answer, and if I had the answer, I would have implemented it at ModelOff. I think we do have to acknowledge that it is a world where generally, like, little girls are not necessarily encouraged that maths is for them. Little boys are not encouraged that caring about small children is for them. Like, we very definitely bifurcate the messages we give to them, and I think we also bifurcate our response when they do stuff. So one of the kind of realizations I had about myself is that if I go into something and there's like a panel and there's like 3 guys and a woman, I internally kind of assume that the woman is sort of there to sort of make up the gender numbers and maybe doesn't know as much as the rest. And that's not a great assumption. It's almost certainly not true. She's probably had to overcome more barriers than the rest of them to get even to that point. And then as a woman, you're then faced with a room that is slightly more hostile to you than it is to everybody else. And again, that kind of thing that I said earlier about kind of in every interaction, slightly feeling that I have to prove myself. And the other thing I found really interesting about that kind of ModelOff, meaning that I kind of felt that when I went into our interactions cold, I didn't have to improve myself anymore, is that when I had that discussion with like you and Alex and some of the other guys who won it early on, and I said, I felt there was a real change in how people interacted with me after I'd won ModelOff. And you were like, no, that was never a problem. Everyone always treated us seriously. What are you talking about?
Yeah, I mean, I think part of that for me is just my, I was never in a kind of, well, except briefly in my consulting days, but like for most of my career, most of like the middle of my career, I was never in a kind of role where I was facing off against new clients regularly. It was like an internal facing role. So I was always kind of dealing with the same team. So it was always sort of known quantity. But yeah, the element of, all right, so here's a new person and what's their immediate reaction to you? Yeah, there's lots of assumptions in there.
Yeah, so I think that is the world we live in. But I think if you say, well, that is the world we live in, well, then what are you doing about it? If you've got companies, I know what Operis is doing in terms of how sort of changing its recruitment process so that it doesn't it works with the way that women tend to apply to things. And I would say our intake is excellent. And they are now kind of, I think actually in the last little while, we've had more than 50% women coming in. So that's part of it. But there are companies that if you're saying there's nothing we can do about it, well, then work with somebody who's trying to do something about it. There's certainly charities in the UK, which your organization can partner with to sort of encourage STEM in schools for young girls. So if you're going, the problem, we can't possibly fix our gender diversity issue because there's a pipeline issue. What are you doing about the pipeline? And I don't know if it's a spin-off of FMWC but I know they're doing some stuff with some of the there's a collegiate competition in the US or something now.
Yep.
And I think, and that was one conversation we had back in the days of ModelOff, is that kind of the younger you looked, the better the balance was. And
Yep.
so things like the under 25 stuff is maybe more accessible. If you have like a student one, it's maybe more accessible. And I think then as people get, I didn't really feel that being female, certainly in terms of internally, was never relevant to how I interact with work until I had children. So I think like we generally have an issue around that and how we manage work and parenting and the fact that small children need their parents. And a world that kind of only lets them have access to one parent, or doesn't, or kind of says, actually, no, if you want to have a career, you need to work 9 till 5, 9 till 6, 5 days a week. That's how it is. That doesn't work for small children. Some small children it works for, some families that's a choice that works for them. They find childcare that works for them. But I think generally, as a society, when we have this conversation about childcare, we mostly go, okay, how do we get all the children into childcare so that everybody can work full time? And I don't think that's the answer that we should be looking for. I think the answer we should be looking for is how do we give equal flexibility to everyone who wants it. Like a lot of people have responsibilities, whether that's children or not, because we have the capacity, right? As a society, there are enough people to do the work. And how do we build an economic system and a system of work that allows people to do work that's meaningful, to spend time with their families, to earn enough money to support those families, and recognizing the value that is found in spending time with small children, which is, if I'm honest, a far better investment in the future of this nation than the time that I spend modeling.
I couldn't possibly comment on that trade-off. But you know, it's interesting. Like I think you're right that there's a lot of it is, you know, how does like the whole system work, the whole country work? I think there's also a lot to be said for the sort of self-interest of a company, like of Operas, for example, having you and having, you know, your experience and your profile and everything, working for them part-time, you know, passing on all your kind of accumulated knowledge to new people versus just not having you. Like
and I also think it can be very short-sighted, because actually children are young for quite a small period of time in the grand scheme of things. I will have preschool children for about 7 years in total. That's really not that much. And to kind of write someone off because, you know, they've got a preschool child it's stupid.
Yes. And look, the truth is, you know, it probably shouldn't be like this, and in a you know, overall better system, it might not be like this. But part of the calculus for a company is also, it's a little unusual to be flexible, but that is also a point of differentiation. Like Operas having you work flexibly for 5 years, for example, probably means that Operas will have you for a lot more than 5 years as you become more able to work, and your children are like, Mom, I don't want to hang out with you. I'm going to go play with my friends.
They'll never do that.
Oh, I'm sorry. Of course they won't. My 7-year-old practically already does that. I mean, it's interesting as we talk about, you know, balancing work and family, that this session was bookended by, you know, we couldn't start earlier because I had to drop my kids at school, and we couldn't run later because you have to pick your kids up from school. As I drop my kids at school this morning, you know, they like to have a book read to them as we walk. But it was very, very noticeable that as soon as we got there, my older son was gone. Like in the middle of a sentence, the middle of a chapter is like, forget about it. My friends are here now. I'm not staying with you.
Yeah.
And it's only going to get more like that.
Well, my 6-year-old has promised to go out with me for coffee after I pick him up. I don't on Fridays. So my husband has recently gone part-time as well. So he works a 4-day week. So I am able to do this conversation with you because Fridays belong to me now. And my 6-year-old usually consents to go with a coffee with me on his own after school on Friday, and we get to have a bit of a catch up. So that's nice because I don't often get a lot of one-on-one time with him.
Very nice. Very nice.
So the kind of flexibility all round is very beneficial. And sorry, I realized I kind of went off topic when you asked me about what the FMWC is doing. I know they do work with like there's a women in financial modeling group, which I think they do kind of have a link with, and obviously there have been women that have done well. They had the women's battle, which you and I hosted. I think there probably is I don't know what drives the differences, because I do know that I know a lot of women who do modeling, and on average I would say the women I know that do modeling are probably on average better than the men that I know that do modeling. Sorry, because I think there's just a higher barrier to getting in there, and obviously there are women involved in the competition who have done very well, and I had a bit of a about coming back to compete. I was a little bit because I kind of felt like I was representing all women. I was like, I know I'm not going to win. I'm not competitive speed. I'm not going to put the hours in to make sure I know all the new features of Excel in terms of being able to complete all the questions. And if I go in and compete and don't do well, am I losing on behalf of all women? And I had a bit of a hang up about that for a bit of kind of
yeah.
It's kind of when you've only got a few visible women, it can put a lot of pressure on those individuals, which isn't
100%
fair or good.
Yeah, it's exactly like you said. When there are only a few, and there are, there's an even smaller number that are, doing as well as you are, that's it's a lot of pressure. And it's I mean, a big part of it is, it's whatever, I guess 7 or 8 years since you competed, but also your job isn't model building anymore. It's teaching and QA and whatever, any kind of training aside, it's just that's not your working life anymore, doing this stuff.
I mean, I wasn't up to this. I won in 2013, and I knew in 2014 that I wasn't up to the speed because I'd kind of moved more into kind of a management thing. At least I lost to a decent guy.
I don't know. I hear he's a bit of a hanger-on.
Yeah, I was a bit obsessed with the competition. Didn't know where to stop, but
Still doesn't.
He's a nice guy. He's got a lovely family.
He does have a lovely family. That is true. Well, look, I think we've gone a little bit around the houses, but we've sort of touched on everything that we were thinking of. I just remembered, actually, there's one question from the chat from way back at the start, which was Liana had a second question, which is, are there any non-Excel tools or languages you use for work? So I'll let you answer that one, and then I'll let you go get your kids from school. No. Oh, well, no. Simple answer.
There's add-ins in Excel, Opera has one that's in-house that we use that is particularly useful for auditing, because it lets us, there's two things that are particularly useful. One is that it compares two models and aligns them, which when we're kind of looking at one model and then looking at a new version of the model is exceedingly useful, because there's no kind of equivalent of doing a Delta version in Word for Excel. And the other thing it does that's really useful is it copies the cell address that you're currently looking at, which when you're writing issues saves a lot of time. If you're here is where it is.
Oh, interesting. I've never done proper model audit. That copying a cell address would never even have occurred to me.
No, well, that's probably, now that I'm not so much doing the live auditing, so I'm not doing the compare stuff myself, that is probably the feature in Oak that I use the most.
Well, thank you very much for taking the time. It's been interesting. It's been fun, and I'm going to hit that big red end stream button. Any last words?
Goodbye.